Here you are. And we are ready whenever you are.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Darla Liles, and I'm from East Carolina University here in North Carolina. And so what my topic is today is to talk to you a little bit about research and why it's important in TTP and thrombotic microangiopathy. So if we could go to the next slide. And I think it's important to understand the difference between usual medical care and clinical research, because they really are two different things. But this kind of gets us to where we need to be over here in clinical practice. And it starts way over here in basic science. So we have people here at a university who are always at the bench, developing new therapies that might work and testing them, and they're nowhere near ready for someone to go ahead and get them in the clinic. And it has to go through years and years of work to get there. We go through translational research, and then through clinical research, and finally come to clinical practice. And clinical practice is really what we all consider standard of care, what most of us would do to people on a reasonable day in the clinic. Next slide. So what is important to know is what we do as standard of care was tested in a clinical trial 4 to 5 years before it really became standard practice. So by participating in a clinical trial, you may have the option to receive a new medication that others will not have had the chance of receiving years before the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, approves it. However, when you're participating in a clinical trial, no one can ever guarantee that you will have a benefit from receiving this medication. That's really the question that we're trying to answer by doing the clinical trial. Next slide. Next slide. So this is my brother Marty. My brother Marty works as an engineer for the Missouri Department of Transportation. He made this little video, and really this is because he's wanting people to be safe. Here in my practice, I also want people to be safe. So Marty wears orange for safety because he's an engineer and he wants people to see him on the road. I do other things to make it safe for my patients. Next slide. So I think that there's many levels of safety that we actually do to try to make sure that when we start a clinical trial, that the patients in it are going to be safe. So that's the one theme that I want you all to understand today as we go through this, is that all the things that we put in place are so that we can answer a question, but so that we can also make it safe for you. So there's requirements for an individual researcher or a study team member that any person who is part of the team running the study has to complete a lot of education about how to make sure the study is safe for patients. So there's something called city modules and good clinical practice. We have to renew our certification every 3 years so that we learn about the new laws about patient safety. There's educational courses, like I said, good clinical practices that we also have to do every 3 years. And every time we start a new study, the investigator and the staff have to promise the IRB that we're there to make sure that patients are safe. Next slide. So it starts out by someone like myself having an idea that we call a hypothesis. And we research that to find out what is already known about the problem or disease, because obviously we don't want to write up a whole protocol about that and then find out later the question's already been answered. So we make sure that we know about the background of a substance or an idea so that we'll know if there's something new that we can discover about that. We write a very detailed paper called a protocol, which contains information about the reason the problem is important and how we plan to go about solving the problem. The protocol contains information about who may be involved in the clinical trial and who cannot be involved, as well as the risks and possible benefits to participating in the study. Frequently, we have to ask other people to be involved in developing this. So we'll oftentimes ask a statistician to calculate how many people it will require to answer a question. So if it's TTP, we may say that we need 1,000 patients to answer that question. And I know right away that here at my institution, I don't have 1,000 patients with TTP this year. So I will then invite other people into the study so that we can have enough patients to know that the answer is the correct answer. Next slide. We have something called an institutional review board. We have one here, and every institution has one. And it's a group of individuals who will collectively review the clinical trial. And they're required to look at the protocol very carefully and approve it based on whether they feel it's safe for patients. This group of individuals includes other doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and even community members like yourself. So they really are looking out for the patients. They may look at the protocol and they may approve it right away, or they may tell the investigator that the protocol needs to be changed to make sure it's ethical and the patients who participate are kept safe. Next slide. So I'm going to go through the step-by-step of what happens as you go through a clinical trial. So if you're approached about a clinical trial, there's several steps that happen. Some of those steps happen even before you may know it. And we'll go through slide by slide. There's going to be pre-screening, informed consent, screening, randomization, what happens actually during the study, the end of the study, and then the follow-up. So next slide. So the first thing is recruitment for a trial. You know, I see patients with TTP, so I already have patients in my clinic that have TTP. So if I open up a trial for TTP, the first thing I do is I look at my own patients to see if there's anyone that might qualify for the trial. I may also talk to some of my colleagues here in the office who also treat the same kind of patients. There are obviously a lot of other trials. Maybe there's trials here in the university where we need healthy volunteers. So I saw a study come across the other day that they wanted healthy volunteers that weren't on lipid lowering medicine. So those people may get patients by advertising in the newspaper, by sending out emails. All of the things that we do to actually recruit for a clinical trial have to be approved by the IRB. They want to know that what we're saying to patients is, again, going to make them safe and not going to coerce them to participate unreasonably. Next slide. We go through a pre-screening process. So I have a group of people in my office that are dedicated to clinical trials, and they will help me identify patients who have the disorder of interest. Here, we're talking about TTP. They'll narrow that down by looking at what we call inclusion criteria. So it says, in this study, patients must have TTP. They must have a blood count that looks like this. They must have an atom TS13 of this amount. They must have an acute episode of TTP. So you may start out with 100 patients with a disorder, but then only a fraction of those will meet the initial criteria to be included. So this pre-screening, as you can see on the pictorial, will kind of narrow it down. A lot of people will be thrown out and excluded based on those initial inclusion criteria, and only a couple of them may actually then be eligible for the clinical trial. Next slide. So the next thing we do is what we call informed consent. This is where we sit down with the patient and discuss the study. We give them a copy of a very long consent form, and it tells them all about the study. It describes what's going to happen in the study. It describes any of the risks that we know already about the study. It explains every visit that they're going to have to come for, and it explains what their other options are for the study. So it may say, you have an option to be in the study, Your other option is just to go be treated in the clinic by Dr. Liles with standard of care. We explain to them all the things that happen, all the things that won't happen to them during the study. If they're going to have a blood draw, we explain how much blood will be drawn. And then we allow them to consider the decision when possible. So I like to oftentimes approach the patients, tell them about it, and then allow them to even take it home and read about it and then come back another time. I usually also have them talk to someone else. So I have a clinical research associate who I turn it over to. So then it doesn't feel like they're, again, being unduly coerced to come into the study, that they feel that they have that option to say yes or no. So that really is what informed consent is all about. Next slide. So there's many required elements for the informed consent document. Again, I have to put my name on it that I'm running the trial, and I have to have my contact information on there. We have to tell people what we're studying. So again, we may say we're studying TTP, acute episodes of TTP, or we may say that we're studying longitudinal TTP patients in and out of acute crisis. We're going to tell them what happens during the study. We tell them what are the known side effects. Again, what are your options besides participating in a trial? What are your rights? And what to do if you want to participate, or if you decide later you no longer want to participate. Because every time that you come for a visit, it is completely your option to continue to participate. So every time that someone comes for another study visit, my clinical research associate and I ask patients, do you still want to participate in this? And give them the option to continue participating or to withdraw. Next slide. So I talked about that pre-screening, but after people have signed an informed consent, we are required to then further screen them, because there are some tests that can only be done after they've gotten into the trial. So there'll be lab tests, maybe an EKG, and we go through additional inclusion and exclusion criteria. So if your liver tests are too high, we didn't know that before we signed the informed consent because these tests are being done specifically, that may then exclude you from being in that. If people don't meet the exclusion criteria, then we call them screen failures. So we initially had that population, if you remember, of 2 patients that were eligible for the clinical trial. It may be narrowed down to 1 after we do this additional screening. Next slide. Once we have the patient that's actually going to be in the clinical trial, we have a treatment group assignment. And that's not an assignment by me or my clinical research associate. It's usually an assignment by a computer or someone that's not associated with the clinical trial here. So typically the assignment to a particular group is random. So it's not up to me. They don't want to make it appear that I might bias the trial. The patient and the investigator, neither one of us know which arm they're assigned to. So I'll put the patient in the trial and they'll tell me that, the computer will tell me that they're assigned to arm A or arm B, and we remain blinded to the treatment arms until the end of the study. Usually there's someone here, such as a pharmacist, because the pharmacist is actually mixing the drugs, that knows, but the rest of the study team does not, and they're not allowed to tell us which arm the patient is on. Next slide. During the actual clinical trial, there's in the protocol, there is a list of assessments and visits. And this is an example of one where it tells us exactly what we have to do every day when the patient comes. So you may have blood work you have to do, we may have a physical exam, we may have an EKG. It's a very detailed list and tells us exactly what we have to do at each visit. Next slide. During the clinical trial, we ask you extra questions. We talk to you more often. We may call you on the phone we may ask that you share with us anything that happens during that clinical trial. So things that are called adverse events, or any abnormal thing that happens during the clinical trial. So this can include things that are related to the drug or intervention, or even things that are unrelated to that. There are things called serious adverse events that are much more abnormal things that may stop me from allowing you to continue in the trial or stop the entire study. And again, these are things that can be related to the study or completely unrelated. So if I have a patient that has an automobile accident on the way to their visit, I have to report that to the main site. And I may say that it's unrelated, that you were on your way to your visit and you had a fender bender, but I have to report that. If you get hospitalized, I have to report that as an adverse event. If you get a rash. So all of those things are reportable, and then we decide which are associated with the intervention or the medicine and which are not associated. And I have to fill out a very detailed report about that. There's a lot of, next slide. There's a lot of oversight of a clinical trial. So we have a number of people that are always looking at things. Obviously, I would be the site investigator here, and I'm responsible for the conduct of the trial here at this site. But I also have a clinical research associate and a research nurse that also helps me. So I may sit down and talk to the patient and do a history and physical, and I might write in my history and physical that the patient tells me that they have a rash. I may describe the rash, and then the clinical research nurse goes behind me and also asks the patients to see if they get any additional details, and we report all of those things. The pharmaceutical company or the CRO that may be conducting a big study also has some oversight, so they will have folks that come into my site and look over all of the documentation that we have and tell us if there's anything missing. The study oftentimes has what we call a data and safety monitoring committee, and that may look at the data to decide if all of a sudden the arms, one of them shows clear benefit, people might decide to stop the study early on. And then of course, the FDA is always looking at all trials to ensure that it's safely being administered. Next slide. The FDA actually will audit clinical trials. So at the very end of the study, if the pharmaceutical company finds out that this new medicine for a particular illness has been helpful, they may decide to apply to have it approved based on the results. When the FDA receives the application, they will go to some of the study sites to review the data to make sure it's correct and that the results have been reported correctly, so they can make a good decision about whether the medication should be approved to treat the disease being studied. So they'll go out and collect data and then make sure that the study was properly conducted. Next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the common myths about clinical trials. And that's because I oftentimes am approaching patients about clinical trials and they'll say, I'm going to be a guinea pig, or, I'll never get the medicine that was supposed to be there. So I wanted to kind of talk about some of these things that I've heard. So the myth is that I must give up the chance to receive standard of care in order to participate in a clinical trial. So the truth is that many trials contain the standard of care as part of the treatment. And that's because, for instance, in the Kablivi clinical trial that we participated in, you want the patient to already be getting the standard of care that's happening, the plasma exchange, the steroids, and the only difference is the addition of the other medicine, the new medicine. So you're still getting standard of care as part of that. Next slide. So myth, I will never know the results of the clinical trial in which I participate. Well, the truth is the results are published online and typically in medical journals, and that most pharmaceutical companies actually send out a communication regarding the final results of the study. So they'll actually thank the participants and want the participants to know what the results are. Next slide. Myth: I don't have access to the experimental treatments even if it's working. Well, the truth is that the companies are obligated to provide therapies that work for a patient until it's FDA approved. So if the patients are benefiting from this, they will continue giving them medication. They oftentimes the pharmaceutical companies often have compassionate programs or extension programs to continue to provide that medication while they're going through that FDA approval. So it's not like patients are just abruptly taken off medicine and then not allowed to have any medication until it's FDA approved, especially if it's working for them. Next slide. Myth is investigators conceal evidence when an experimental treatment doesn't perform as well as expected. The truth is that all results must be reported to the FDA, and if the data reporting is not correct, the FDA will not allow the pharmaceutical company and the investigator to withdraw the data. So we actually do publish negative results, and that's important information as well. Obviously, we like to talk most about medications that work well for a particular thing, but it's also important for clinical practice to be able to know when something doesn't work. Next slide. Myth: I will get a placebo instead of actual treatment in a clinical trial. So the truth is, if the clinical trial has one arm that is a placebo, I am required to tell the patient that before they consent. In some diseases, it's considered unethical to use a placebo, but in other diseases, we must use a placebo. And I know that sounds like a scary concept, but if I don't know that a treatment works or not, unless I have an arm that's a placebo where you're not getting anything, I won't be able to tell. Again, most of the time, we're still providing standard of care, and then either the drug or the placebo on top of that. Next slide. I must pay for out-of-pocket for the cost of receiving treatment in a clinical trial because insurance doesn't cover experimental therapy. Well, the truth is that some of the treatments are provided free of charge as experimental medicines because we're studying them. So a drug company that starts a clinical trial can't charge you for a medicine that's not FDA approved. Also, insurance companies continue to cover any standard of care labs and treatments that we would already do outside of a clinical trial. So your insurance will still cover that standard of care, and then the drug company will provide the medicine free of charge. Next slide. Once you sign up for a clinical trial, you're not allowed to stop it until the very end. So the truth is that you're actually in complete control. You can stop the trial at any moment from the time you sign the consent and throughout all of the study visits. It's happened numerous times. I've had it happen in my own studies. You have to feel comfortable with what you're participating in and that you want to continue to participate. And like I said, what I typically do is I ask people each time they come in for a visit, you still want to participate, you're still willing to participate, and have to get some kind of verbal confirmation from them if they're still willing to participate. Next slide. So it's important to kind of know what kind of clinical trials, because there are some that are much more risky than others. So there's different phases of clinical trials. Phase 1 clinical trials is really the first type of trial that we use when a new medicine is developed. So this is when we're trying to figure out what kinds of diseases a specific drug may be used for. It's typically used on a small number of patients with several different types of diseases, oftentimes several very severe forms of disease, perhaps patients that have already been through all of the usual therapies and don't have a lot of other options to try. So this is very tightly regulated because the questions we're trying to answer with a phase 1 trial is the treatment safe? So oftentimes a phase 1 trial will start at a very low dose and escalate it up with only a few patients each time. And the study will be stopped in between so they can analyze the data and make sure it's still safe for patients. So we're trying to tell what kind of dose of medicine, of treatment that should be given. And then again, any side effects of these treatments. So very tightly regulated kind of trial, not something that you would do when you first got diagnosed with an illness, and usually perhaps after you had used other conventional therapies. Next slide, please. So we'll oftentimes give it to a group of people with various different diseases and see which disease it has a specific effect on. Phase 2 trials is used to determine, once you go through a phase 1 trial, you go to a phase 2 trial, and it may only have a single arm. So once you then have a specific disease, you will call it a phase 2 trial, and it'll tell you what effect the treatment has on a disease or condition. Next slide. A phase 3 clinical trial is done on a much larger scale, on a larger number of patients with a particular disease. It's probably one of the more common phases of trials that we do. It usually has a couple of different arms. And so, again, it will compare the new treatment to a standard treatment. Next slide. Phase 4 is a type of trial done on a very large group of patients after the drug has been FDA approved. And you would think, why do we need to continue to do trials after it's been approved? But there are still some questions that are being answered by phase 4 clinical trials. So what are the effects of treatment in different patients over time? Because oftentimes earlier trials have only been for 6 months or a year of your time, and we want to see what happens over a longer period. So what are the long-term effects and risks, and what are the long-term benefits, or some of the things that you can answer with a phase 4 trial? And how is the new treatment incorporated into medical care? So how are people using this medicine along with the other approved therapies that existed previously? Next slide. So kind of some of my final thoughts about clinical trials. I want you to remember that participation in a clinical trial should feel completely voluntary. And if you decide to participate in a clinical trial, you can decide to stop at any point. It's totally in your hands. And overall, I believe that participating in a clinical trial is safe and helps develop new therapies for disease. And sometimes actually you get followed a little more closely on a clinical trial than you might have otherwise, because we have all those visits. So it may be helpful as well in that way. And last slide, I think, is just all right.
So now I'm going to bring forth some of the panelists, and we'll just answer a few quick questions about clinical research and how that typically goes. Is Tiffany with you? Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
I was searching for you.
I was working on our COVID trial earlier today, so.
Well, that figures.
That's right.
All right. Well, for the ones that didn't just give a presentation, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, that way everybody is aware. I know a few of you have spoken earlier, so go ahead.
Well, hello everyone, my name is Ryan Woods. I'm a physician over at Wake Forest in North Carolina, in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And I'm involved in research in a couple of different areas, but one area is in the laboratory in addition to clinical trials. And so I'm very happy, and it's been a great meeting so far, and happy to help answer some questions and maybe answer any burning questions you all have about research.
So my name is Dee Terrell. I'm an epidemiologist at the University of Oklahoma. I worked for about 10 years as a clinical trials coordinator while I was going to school, and now I am the PI of my own studies.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Moore. I'm a study coordinator here at East Carolina, working with Dr. Liles in her hematology trials.
Great. So one of the first questions is there any research going on as to what the cause of the antibodies that attack the ADAMTS13 is? So what's actually causing that immune-mediated TTP?
I can try to work on that. It's still a very early field in terms of how we understand the immune system. I think we've gathered a lot of information in the last several years and really decades about how the immune system develops and how the immune system educates itself to fight against viruses. But we still don't know a lot about why the immune system might accidentally attack any one organ system, or in this case, the ADAMTS13 enzyme in the blood. So I think that is still very early, actually. I think from a general perspective, we have sort of a high-level theory that sometimes it's related to a high degree of inflammation, or if the body is exposed to like a virus or an infection, and that stimulates the immune system to fight off that virus, and it sort of hits a friendly target in a way. But beyond that, I don't think we have any conclusive proof, and it's definitely an area of active study.
Okay, great. And this question is actually going to come directly from the patient. So, there we go. Ines Banks, you're able to speak now if you unmute yourself to ask your question. All right, well, in the meantime, there's a question, is there any research into the possibility of gene therapy for TTP?
So I don't believe there's any trials for gene therapy that I know of in either congenital or acquired TTP. You'd probably try for congenital TTP first.
I agree. I'm not aware of any specific clinical trials yet. We're really excited in a lot of areas of hematology for gene therapy and bleeding disorders, and I think we're learning a lot about maybe common pathways or mechanisms for which gene therapy might work in more than just those areas. So I think we're very excited from a general perspective, but I think right now we're still a little bit in the early phases about how that might work for something like TTP.
Okay. Dr. Terrell, you mentioned that you're now the PI of your own studies. Do you want to talk a little bit about the ones that you've completed or any that you would like to mention?
Sure. I am very interested in the long-term impacts of TTP. So I have a grant right now from the National Institutes of Health that's really focused on what happens after you recover from TTP. And so in the last session, we talked a lot about like these lingering effects, and the whole day has kind of been spent on the fact that it's not an acute illness like we used to think. So I've completed AIM-1, which was really asking from the patient's perspective, what are the things that kind of impact them the most? And the things that came to the top were cognitive impairment, fatigue, anxiety, and depression. And so now I'm in AIM-2, where I'm trying to really, again, from the patient's perspective, ask patients to take surveys, and then they're going to basically compare that to the general population, because in the general population you have people who aren't quote unquote healthy. And so is this something that people, that when we compare to the general population, is it what we expect or is it worse? And so that's what I'm currently working on.
Here's a question. Is there any correlation between the new treatments for sickle cell disease and TTP?
I'm not aware of any quite developments on that yet. I think we're referring to maybe some of the newer agents that help sickle cell and reduce the sickling crises or other issues associated with that. Since that's probably a different, well, it is a different mechanism of what causes sort of a problem in the bloodstream. I don't think that those would have a dramatic, or we wouldn't think those would have a significant impact on TTP and the immune system and the ADAMS TS13 process. But definitely some excitement in both of those fields for better outcomes for patients.
Although they are utilizing the ADAMS TS13 in a sickle cell
Right.
trial. So I think there is going to be some crosstalk there.
Okay, so here's another good one for you, Tiffany and Dr. Liles. If you live far away from a center that's doing a trial, who pays for travel expenses? So is there, the possibility if you have a rare disease and it's only a few sites that the sponsor or another site might be able to pay for those expenses?
Yeah, so I think that actually the sponsor will oftentimes, because they, these are rare diseases and they want to get people into these. So we've had actually good luck with, we have people that live a couple of hours from our site, and even getting them, a driver to bring them here, or, other, gas cars, other things. So they will pay for participation in a trial. It's always a little bit troublesome because you don't want to pay people so much that it's like you feel like you're coercing them to participate, but obviously defraying the costs of if they had to stay overnight or to get them actually here is appropriate.
And what new treatments for TTP are you guys aware of in studies currently? So I don't know if anyone wants to talk about the congenital or the recombinant ADAMS TS13 that's being evaluated, or the recent approval of CAPLA. You guys want to discuss those?
Yeah, I think that we were, several of us were involved in the Cablivi trial that got it to be able to be approved. And so that was a very exciting one. And I think that right now it's really figuring out how we can utilize that in patients. And then again, there is a congenital, we're not involved in the ADAMS TS13 trial for congenital, but there's a site here close to us that we can refer congenital patients to.
And other than actually participating in the clinical trials, how would you guys recommend that a patient supports these efforts or supports research? So what do you think they would be able to do? In my mind, educating others about clinical trials, potentially fundraising for research in whatever disease process is affected, making sure they keep open communication with their physicians to be aware of any trials they may want to be participating in, because there are some that are very low demand on the patient, like registries or biobanks where they're able to keep your extra blood to evaluate. Do you guys have anything that you'd like to suggest?
Yeah, I was going to mention that I think that the clinical trials that Dr. Liles had mentioned earlier is a really vital place or point of research for medical care. But really, research extends in several ways from that in other areas. It might involve laboratory work. It might involve more of a questionnaire basis, or just following and see how folks do. A lot of what we do in our lab is really just trying to figure out patterns of why patients have had TTP in the past. So trying to understand what happened to try to better guide what might be an important therapy to try in a preclinical or phase 1 trial at some point in the future. So I think that the clinical trials sometimes, a lot of other clinical research happens prior to that point, And so there's a lot of opportunities to be involved in a lot of areas. For something like TTP specifically, I think something like being involved in the USTMA has been really helpful because it's such a rare condition that sometimes resources can get sort of strained amongst a wide swath of the country, or even, really, it's really vital for us to have a lot of active collaboration with international colleagues or colleagues on the other side of the country to really pool our collective experiences and patients. That's the only way we actually generally can achieve the kind of numbers in one area to have a statistical result that is accurate, and we can be confident in the results. So a lot of awareness and advocacy, I think, is a really, really helpful vital instrument for us to sort of continue research beyond just participation in trial.
And I would like to add one other thing is just, because I know sometimes clinical trials seem scary. So the other thing is just participating in support groups and talking to your physician. So for example, the long-term outcomes that I'm interested in, that came organically from patients just telling us that they don't feel good. And so it wasn't that something that we thought of, it was something that the patients just kept telling us, and we kept saying, you know what, you're going to get better, you're going to get better. And they kept saying, no, I'm not better. And so just being honest with your physician and letting them know what you're dealing with so that they can kind of talk to other colleagues and be like, hey, my patients are telling me this, are you hearing that? So, that's what I would say.
Well, that is just a perfect transition into our next speaker, Dr. Jim George, I'm going to bring up. Thank you so much, everybody. That was a great presentation on research. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Thank you. Go ahead and move everybody back to attendees. All right. And I'm going to welcome to the virtual stage Dr. Jim George, who will be giving us an overview of exactly that support group that Dee was talking about.